Good morning. This is the ninth episode of Fix Your Feed, a very special episode because I have a guest, Kristof Kramer. Welcome.
Let's start that one again because it's Kristof Kazmer. Hey,
Oh, sorry.
mate, if I had a dollar for every time someone called me Kramer, I reckon I'd be on Seinfeld by now. I'd probably pay my way on there.
Kristof Kazmer. That's em
Welcome.
that's embarrassing.
Don't be silly. Do you know, as I said to you, it's not the first time I get it. But yeah, no, great to be here. Thanks for having me, Tim.
Thank you. You know why it's doubly embarrassing? It's because out of all the people on LinkedIn, I probably consume your content the most. So to
Oh,
flub that is, yeah.
that's right. We'll move on. What a day. How are we?
I'm well. It's a beautiful day in Sydney, Australia. The sun is shining. Um, it's a good day to talk about a potentially dark subject, cybersecurity, and you're the man to
Ooh,
educate me.
mate, it is a dark topic at the moment, isn't it? There's a lot that unfortunately has been uncovered of recent. And yeah, I'm hoping to shed some light on it, some sunlight, some warmth, rather than making it a dark conversation.
Yeah, that's good. So is it fair to say you present yourself as a cybersecurity professional?
Yeah, look, I'd like to say that is one of many hats I like to wear. Being in the industry for near on 30 years, don't mind my grey hairs. I've certainly had both hands-on experience as well as consulting and strategic engagement. But that's only one gamut that I like to cover, Tim. We certainly like data. That's my criticality. Data is the key to everything, my friend.
Yeah, that's interesting because whenever we see a cybersecurity related story in the news, as you say, it is tied to data, isn't it? It's usually a data breach, data has leaked, or data has been shared with people who shouldn't have access to it. Um, so what attracts you to cybersecurity? Do you need to be a paranoid or a deeply suspicious person to be a top-notch cybersecurity professional?
Mate, interesting point. Yes, there is some level of anxiety that you've got to carry, I'd say, to be interested in this topic. The other thing about cybersecurity is that it is so vastly evolved. And to your point about data, data wasn't even a point of contention or consideration in the last 10 years. And we've seen marketing use the term data is the new oil. It's not the new oil. It's been the oil that's greased the wheels of the fifth revolution, industrial revolution already for quite some time. We're heading into that now. And the fourth revolution was heavily based around data. And so for me, I'm no Jason Bourne. I'm certainly not going to go out there and actively, fight defense physically. But the best way you can do that is taking that level both from a virtual aspect, but also from an education perspective, Tim. And I think that's one of the things, my biggest value is around problem solving. And so from that perspective, being in technology, not just in security, gives me the opportunity to address that and constantly be solving problems and addressing the opportunity to make people's lives better through technology.
I like that. I feel that I do need to be educated about data. It's interesting you use that phrase, data being oil, because oil is valuable. It's a commodity, but it costs money. But whenever I go online, it seems that I'm always being asked for my data. So, like as a consumer, if I want to create an account on an e-commerce website or whatever it is, I'm always asked for personal details like street address, name, mobile number, email address. But now, I'm constantly reading about data breaches. Should I be suspicious whenever I'm asked for details?
Look, let me answer that in a two-part question. So the word data has an etymology, and the etymology of the word data is around giving in actual fact. So the concept of data is that it's given. And therefore it is what we would consider in the industry as first-party data. So when you provide the data that you spoke about, so go online and you need to provide your email address, your name, your physical address, that's considered first-party data. When you look at the amount of data that's consumed and produced on the internet, the issue with you providing the data that you have as identifying or personally identifiable information, PII, can be coupled with what's known as third-party data. So that might have been activity that you did on another platform that is then coupled and enriched with the data that you've already given to give a bit more of a detail about you as a person, your buying patterns, what you're likely to do, and how you're likely to interact with a product. So that in itself would lend itself to how you would think about data. So when you share it, first party, but when you go on social media, and as an example, and you start to comment about certain products that you've seen, or you do a Google search on certain products, be wary that that data is shared. And the biggest industry that we know today is called data brokerage, where data is shared between multiple players. And if you think about it, there is only three real big players: Alphabet, known as Google; Meta, known as Facebook, Snapchat, WhatsApp; and of course, Microsoft. So we start to talk about those guys as the three major players in the data space. Now, to answer your question in the second part, should you be nervous about that data? Absolutely. I mean, identifiable data should always be kept to a minimal as much as possible. And by using, let's call it interface gateways or intermediary services, it's usually a best way to try and keep some of your data safe. An example of that is, you know how you go onto a website and it says, please let me sign you in with a social media account. Don't. That's a
Oh,
top tip straight away.
okay.
Don't. Because when you look at what happens in the background is that you're going to get the questions that they authorize you to be able to answer is not just your email address and your personal details, but they'll also have some access to your social activities or things that you like, which can tailor their experience. And you'll see this when you go to a website, for example. I don't know about you guys, but if you're noticing when you go to a website, you pop up and then it'll ask you about cookies. Now, cookies, whilst they're delicious and tasty, they're actually probably the worst way third-party data gets shared. So you are asked about that. Top tip again, go in, reject all as much as you can so that your information isn't shared across the interweb through data brokers.
Right. So the example you gave of logging into a site with, say, your Google account, or thinking of Facebook, your Meta account,
Mhm.
we're unwittingly giving more data than we think we are by doing that.
Correct. And it also means that they can tie you to a social profile, which again enriches the amount of data they have on you and how they can get more information about your sort of personality, create a fingerprint, let's call it, of you as a person online.
Right. So there's several levels to this, isn't it? Because perhaps we don't want someone to know too much about us, but the goal of whoever is tracking us is to sell us stuff. Maybe stuff we don't need, but nevertheless to sell us stuff. But what about the other level, actors that could be malicious?
Mm.
Are there things we can do to protect our details from actors like that?
Yeah, look, absolutely. Browsing history is one way to do that. I would suggest and recommend, whilst it is a pain, that we definitely clear out our browser history and our cookies at least once a week, if
Oh,
possible.
really? Okay.
Yeah, so the cookies can be shared, and that history can also mean that the data brokers, for example, if you're using Google Chrome, can share your activity. So, look, it's the biggest dichotomy of our current era is convenience versus our information. If you think about the industry as it is today, it's all driven around how much data we can get. Now, there are a lot of regulations coming through in Europe, for example, the GDPR around how that data is handled, who has access to it and what they can do. It hasn't extended past Europe yet, but they are starting to be used and copied across things like in America potentially, and even in Australia, there is some prospect of those sort of data regulations coming in. But it's still prominent to yourself to be careful. And one of the best tips I give people is don't use your corporate email address when you're shopping online. That is the worst thing you can do. The ability for people to use passwords on the same platforms. Let me just say, password reuse is one of the biggest reasons we get breached. Uh, if you're using the same password on your banking account as you're doing on your email, don't do that, please. Especially not if you're doing the same on Netflix, which unfortunately happens quite a bit.
What you're saying, it's best to have a unique password for every site you have an account on, whether that's shopping or some SaaS service, some piece of
Mm.
software we've subscribed to.
Yeah, and look, there's really easy ways to do that. It's called a password manager.
Yeah.
So strongly suggest, the ASCS, Australian Cybersecurity Council as well, offers top tips on how you do that. So my suggestion is find a password manager that you like and that you're used to, or someone that is nearby using it. There are a ton of them out there. Let's be fair. LastPass, 1Password, free ones available from people like Bitwarden, for example. And these guys spend copious amounts on securing their platforms so that you have the option to use alphanumeric characters, long-winded passphrases, etc., rather than having to remember. I mean, half the time, I don't even know my passwords, Tim. The best way to do it is through that, using a password manager. And that way, at least you can secure that. And it really does help with not only that, but also in passwords, but also in the fact that if you have these situations where you are breached, the password that you've been breached with will not be used elsewhere. And so people can't use that fingerprint. So prime example, a common breach for corporates or business compromises is you'll have Netflix breached. And unfortunately, as you can appreciate, Netflix has your email address and a password. And if you reuse the same password on your email address as you do on your Netflix, the likelihood is a criminal can go grab that database from the dark web, usually costing around 20 US dollars, go onto Google, type in your Gmail account and attempt to access that using your password. So guess what? Direct access to your email address. There we go. We've started one chain in what's called privilege escalation.
So is that scenario that you so clearly laid out, is that also a good reason to have another level of verifying our identity, like a notification pushed to our smartphone or something like that?
Brilliant topic there, Tim. MFA, multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, depending who you are. Yes, absolutely. Banking, the thing that I concern myself with is that banking hasn't made this the default. It's still made it an option. Yes, I understand it's inconvenient that you have to then go and find something like an email, or you have to find a text message, or you have to go and open a Google Authenticator or a Microsoft Authenticator, add a second layer of protection. But absolutely. And the reason being is that it's having something you know and something you have will make the difference between someone accessing your account. I unfortunately, because of what we do in our industry, I get consistent alerts ping saying that someone's trying to access your account. Please identify them using this code. And you're like, no, that's not my code. So yeah, MFA is definitely important. So yes, please be using MFA, everybody.
Yeah, so we're talking about a level of personal responsibility, or I guess mindfulness of how we're securing ourselves as individuals, as consumers. These are all great tips, but there's another side to this, isn't it? And it's how secure we've handed over our data. Could be our street address, could be our date of birth, could be multiple things. And, we've got a strong password, we've got MFA, the site is legitimate, but then there's the responsibility of the organization that we've handed the data over to actually keep that secure. Because you talked about databases being available on the dark web. So talk us through that. Like, what should an organization, what sort of philosophy or mindset should they be adopting before that they even ask anyone for their data?
Yeah, look, it's a real tough one there, Tim. It's a dichotomy for the ages, I'll tell you. Um, the conundrum that most organizations face here is that they want more data so that they can target and know you better, serve you better, even sell better, whichever version you'd like to use. The other hand on that is that there is a cost to owning and maintaining that data, right? And to your point, how long do they keep it for? And is there any governance around that data where they go, all right, so Tim hasn't logged into our account for near on a year. Tim's inactive. We've reached out to him. We should delete his data so that we don't have a potential compromise. Unfortunately, the guidance around this from a legal perspective is very limited in open businesses. Sure, there's plenty of compliance requirements on certain businesses like SOC requirements, which is for critical infrastructure, which many organizations such as transport, retail are considered. Um, but then again, APRA, so that's in the financial industry. So they have quite a number of considerations around data and how they separate, manage, classify that data. But in the broader sense, it's not something that is from the government down yet. And it is up to individual businesses to go, I shouldn't be keeping data. And we call them data hoards because you can keep large volumes of data, which could potentially get you in trouble in the future, especially in a breach, as you mentioned.
I imagine it's possible some organizations, because, they've been operating for quite some time. You use the word hoarding. Is it possible that perhaps organizations may not even be completely sure what the data is in their possession?
Absolutely. It's highly possible, unless they've got someone who's looking at the data itself, classifying it, it is very difficult to be able to tell. Say you've been in business for 15 years. How do I know that when Tim walked through my door 10 years ago and I asked, do you want to sign up to my marketing, that Tim will still have all exact same details now that you did 15 years ago, and that I probably shouldn't be keeping a copy of Tim, considering I haven't seen Tim in 5 years. So you could have moved interstate for all they know, but they may have some data on you that is personally sensitive. It could be, I mean, I hate to say this, but the club's breach, every time we walk into a club, we're asked to provide our driver's license. That information is so sensitive. The ability to replicate a person online using that, socially engineering them using their, social media, and couple that to create online accounts that they could use to purchase or apply for credit cards, for example, and therefore have access to financial details. That's the sort of stuff that gets really, icky, let's call it, because it can potentially happen. And when we share that data, what's the onus on someone to remove it when it's done? It's like, just don't share my data, firstly. And also, how do I know? I mean, hands up to the audience. How many of you have ever read the terms and conditions when you signed up to something? If you've ever read the terms and conditions to TikTok, you wouldn't sign up. It literally says in its terms and conditions, we will take note of your keystrokes, of everything you do, of your user behavior, even when it's sitting dormant in the background of your device. That's the sort of thing that we don't, as consumers, read. And sure, there are safeguards that are now coming in through legal aspects, but that doesn't apply to certain areas of organizations, especially not when data, sovereignty is something they need to consider. Certainly, I'll give it that.
Yeah, I mean, sadly, I don't read the terms and conditions. I should. You obviously do. The fact that you were able to quote that to me about TikTok, you've obviously read it. You must read a lot of terms and conditions.
Look, I'm not an avid lawyer. I could give you that much. But I definitely I concern myself with some of them, especially the ones that I use regularly. In the event that I'm sharing some data, I will use, as I said, an intermediary. Prime example, Tim, using something like PayPal to pay online is always handy. You're not actually giving that retail organization website the access to your credit card details. And that in itself creates a level of, security The other thing I love to tell people is prepaid credit cards are not a bad thing. You know, if you are to shop online, using a prepaid credit card's never a bad thing. You can always top money up using these prepaid credit cards, make the purchase. If you feel that it's an insecure potential, use that. Use PayPal. Don't give your credit card to a website, especially when you're not sure about it. That's the last thing I'd suggest you do.
Wow, this is gold. I feel like this conversation is going to have so many actionable tips. Um,
I'm hoping only a few of you, take this on board, and it makes a dramatic difference. Our online activity makes such an important foothold to what we do in the future. One of the key factors I love to tell people, don't share photos of your kids online. If you've ever
oh,
seen the Deutsche Telekom ad for how AI can create deep fakes or even age a person, their data that's online today can be used against them in 10 years to create online identification, to create online accounts. Yeah, at that point, they don't have control of their data. Your children do not have control of what you share today. And whatever you do not put photos of your children up online. I know it's great to celebrate them, but having an identifiable voice and face of a child could just be misappropriated in the future. So if anyone's listening, please Google Deutsche Telekom children ad. It's shocking about how it can be misappropriated.
I'll check that out. Yeah, I've always been reticent about sharing photos of my children. One of them's now an adult, one is almost 18. Like I've never shared photos of them on
Hmm.
my profiles because but I did not have the knowledge of how that could be misappropriated. I just thought it was a step too far, and they weren't really, they were children, so they were not part of the decision making. I felt like I would be crossing a boundary by doing that. So yeah, that's really interesting to hear.
Look, if your children have a voice in the situation, Tim, that's another story, right? When they turn 16, they have a voice in it. You know, prior to that, I always suggest avoiding it as much as possible. The worst thing you can do is put photos of your children at their school, right?
Oh,
And that
right.
really, if you think about you are identifying the availability and giving away IP straight away.
Yeah, interesting. You use that term IP because we normally think of that in connection with ideas or products or patents or whatever. But in this age, we are like, it's a brutal thing to say, we are kind of like the product ourselves, aren't we?
Really, really good saying. If you're not paying for a service, you are the product. Unfortunately for us, we're not paying for social media. So
Mm.
guess what? The ultimate fact is we are their product, and the data we create and consume is how they make that money. And I don't know about you, but I'll give you an example. If you scroll through social media, any meta platform, you will find a large volume of the stuff that you see will be advertising. It won't be your friends' activities. It won't be the things that you've done. It'll be, here's some advertising, here's some information about your friends, here's some advertising. And that's how they make their volumes of money, right? At the end of the day, these are multi-billion-dollar assets. They're not talking about $1 or $2 here. The reason being is when you're on that platform, which we get, as Mark Zuckerberg has said, Facebook will always be free, but he has to make money elsewhere. And that's how they do it. We're the product. They're not the product.
So back to cybersecurity and like breaches of data, you obviously consult with organizations, you give them advice. So how do you, as a cybersecurity professional, how do you measure the effectiveness of an organization's cybersecurity stance or security posture? I mean, I guess it doesn't really cut it to say, well, you haven't had a breach, so good enough. There's got to be more to it, surely.
Yeah, Tim, if I had $1 for everyone who says that, I think I'd probably also be able to buy my way onto multi things. Unfortunately, when someone says to me, I haven't been breached, that generally means the lack of awareness. It's not if, it's when. The real statistic, if you look about it, last year statistically, every 6 minutes there's a breach in Australia. It keeps consistently getting less and less. It was 7 years the year prior, 10 years the year, 10 minutes the year prior again. So you've gone from 10 to 7 to 6. The likelihood is we'll see that potentially go to 5 this year. That's what we know. And that's not SMBs. 90% of organizations in Australia are classified as small businesses, as we can appreciate. And they really do turn this economy. But the thing that we don't appreciate is that they still hold vital amounts of data, right? I mean, you hold your staff's details. You absolutely have every information about your staff. If you're breached, your staff's details can get leaked, etc. So getting to the point, what is and what isn't important around data is the criticalities around how do we show we're first doing something about it, right? The first thing to do is actually have some active plans in place. Whether or not you can then report on those where you can show identifiers, where am I at and what am I achieving? That's also another problem. But the other thing to keep in mind is, are there compliance requirements and regulations? Is there a framework that you're trying to achieve? And these are important questions. Now, the majority of small organizations in Australia won't be compliant to a certain requirement. But there is the Australian government's ASD, Australian Signals Directorate Essential 8, right? And these are specifically created to 8 different categories that the organizations can do to help secure them against potential cyber breaches. Now, again, these are Microsoft centric. So if you are using other tools or other platforms, some of these aren't applicable, but it still gives a great basis for people to work towards. And the categories could be around things like application control, putting in place MFA. That is one of the criticalities. Having backups, for example, Tim. The amount of organizations that don't have offsite backups of their data, it's staggering. First things first, get a baseline. Have a look at where you are. Know that against a framework, be it NIST, which is the US basis, be it cyber, the Essential 8. There are a ton of frameworks, ISO if you're a larger organization, but get the baseline. Measure yourself against those categories and controls, and then put in what's known as H1, H2, Horizon 1, Horizon 2 objectives of how you can increase your security posture over these periods. H1 could be 6 months for one organization. H1 could be 12 months for a smaller organization because they know they need to invest and they need to then allocate funding for that. But having a measure of success would be start with the baseline, know what it looks like today and where are my gaps, because the gaps will identify where you need to increase spending, or small changes can increase your security posture vastly. And to your point about MFA, if 30% of organizations in Australia use it, only 30. That's a pretty scary statistic.
So a large organization often has a C-level role, a chief information security officer, but SMBs, smaller businesses, they might not have that dedicated function. So whose responsibility is cybersecurity in a smaller business?
Sad part is it's the owners,
Yeah,
especially in this SMB. Even when you talk about mid-enterprises, the directors are personally liable by Australian law. It's no longer an acceptable stance of I didn't know. Jail time is even something that can be applied to a director
really.
or board, even in the event of a breach where they haven't taken the proper precautions. But the advantage is that there is help out there, Tim. There are organizations like ASE, for example, where people can reach out and get that sort of not only consultancy, but also small wins that they can take and then implement those within their organizations to help. You're right in the fact that CISOs, for example, that you mentioned, Chief Information Security Officers exist majority of the time. Even CISOs get audited though.
Mm.
You've got to consider that one person's word's never something that the board will take. They will actually outsource that. You've seen independent organizations on this growing. It's a growing rate. And there's not enough information security people in Australia. In fact, cybersecurity as an industry is probably the least well-fielded industry in the IT industry right now. And we can't get enough people, enough staff to be able to help support that.
Is that because CISO is that the least appealing job in the business world?
It's a scary proposition, especially when you consider that they can be held to account. So yeah, absolutely. CISOs can make recommendations, right? They can make recommendations to directors, to boards. It doesn't mean that they will be accepted, right? At the end of the day, regardless, the CISO's job is to secure as much as possible within the allocated resources that they have. That doesn't always mean that the resources that they need are available to them. So yeah, I mean, look, there are a ton of CISOs I know, and they're amazing people. Think outside the box kind of people, which, they have to be because sometimes they just don't have the funding, they don't have the ability to do certain, controls or implementations that could help. And yet their asses are on the line. I hate to use that term, but generally speaking, they're the ones that people point at straight away. And we've seen this time and time again with a number of breaches that have been publicly announced recently. To your point, it'd be difficult and much more difficult to find a new CISO role in the event that you were a CISO in an organization that was breached, that was publicly announced.
That is kind of disturbing because other high-level executive roles, a business might lose a lot of money through a, poor business decision or a poorly executed product. But, I don't want to paint too broad of a brush, but, a lot of people in leadership positions can still just easily slide into another equivalent job in another large organization, even if, their previous decisions weren't that great. But that's not the case with the CISO.
No.
It's a lot more sensitive.
Look, yeah, I think the limelight that organizations are being painted with in the event of a breach makes many challenges, not just from a positional direction. If you think about the likelihood is that about 30% of customers will never return to a breached organization. It's just a statistic that's commonly placed out there. You take a considerable amount of time to reignite the organization and to get the trust back from the public. So the real unfortunate situation about breaches, especially for SMBs, is it could be terminal in a breach. I won't mention names, but there is a transport organization down near Wollongong, for example, that unfortunately were breached and had to stand down operations for quite some time and potentially won't recover from a small breach that they were held to ransom with. I understand that it is a concern for organizations to spend money on this. There are quick wins. There are ways to make things better, and it's not hardly expensive. But in the event, I always say this to people that I speak with. If your systems were taken offline today, could you operate tomorrow? And the likelihood of that answer is no. The simple answer, you can't revert back to pen and paper. You cannot take transactions as a retailer. You could not walk up and just continue to operate in good faith. You don't have the old clicker machine where you used to put your credit card on and yes, we'll process that within 48 hours. Those days, unfortunately, thanks to the pandemic, have been pretty much gone. Everything sits online. So you need to have what we call a BCP, or a business continuity plan. How do you recover from this? How do you respond? What's an incident response plan? Who do you notify? And how do you communicate in a calm manner? The unfortunate part about a breach is once it occurs, if you don't have a calm plan that you think out before it happens, you are responding in a stressed position. And as you can appreciate, anyone in a stressed position, just look at parenting, for example. Your lateral thinking and your logical thinking isn't the same as if you'd have, at an 8 hours night's sleep than you would if you've had 2 hours night's sleep. So if you've got, people, debtors, your staff bringing down your neck, you're not going to respond the same way you would, which is why people need to think about these things and pull these plans together before an event occurs so that they can respond calmly, know what's necessary, and then respond accordingly, because incident response is critical to getting a business back online.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Planning for the unthinkable. So, what's more likely, a cybersecurity breach due to the technical sophistication of a hacker, or one due to human error or a mistake that's been made?
Kind of two in the same, if I'm honest, Tim. Statistically speaking, majority of breaches occur because of human interaction, which is unfortunate, which enables your increased hacking capabilities to then go and escalate and laterally move through a network. Business compromise, business email compromise is probably one of the higher ones, BEC. So if you ever see that, and that is the ability to use email to inside activate a breach malware, let's call it. And the scariest thing about any of these cyber events, Tim, is statistically speaking, a cyber event occurs 60 days after they've got inside your network. In fact, some instances it can be later than that. Reason being is these the cyber criminals, threat actors, whichever term you'd like to use, sit in and watch and investigate what's happening within the network and understand what data is critical, right? Snatch and grabs, as we like to call them, less likely these days. You know, the opportunity to get in, grab it, get out, and then throw a ransomware on there is because people, if you're in and out, the recovery opportunity for that is quite high. The reason being is people do have backups. I came in, I locked your systems down, sent you a ransomware note on your screen, and you have 24 hours to pay me this Bitcoin amount. And the likelihood is the backup that you had from last week is recoverable and all you've lost is a week's worth of work, right? That is changed. You know, there is so much technology out there these days, and, you know, we won't go down the rabbit warren of AI, but, you know, the ability for AI to be used to create emails that look so much alike that, you know, an unwitting person will click on it and will then infect an organization is too high. So answering your question, yes, humans are going to be your weakest point. And we like to say, let's turn your staff into a human firewall through education. And that's through training, through unwittingly sending phishing emails. And in the event that they do accidentally click on them, tell them why they shouldn't have, and educate them. Education, number one. This is why I do what I do here. This is why I speak at events and try and talk people into understanding that it's everyone's responsibility. It's not just the organizations.
Yeah, well said. And I think this conversation, this feels like a crash course in lots of concepts for me. So,
Well, I'm glad I could help anyway.
you know your stuff. Uh, you know, you mentioned AI and not going down that rabbit hole. One of the things that really appeals to me about your content on LinkedIn, and anyone listening to this, please find and follow Kristof on LinkedIn, is often you will post like retro sort of posts where you feature an old technology that might have been from the early 90s, maybe even the 80s, as a look back on how we used to interact with technologies. So, uh, what technologies from the ancient past, and when I say ancient, I'm talking about the 90s, maybe the 80s, what do you miss from those simpler times?
Do you know, it's an interesting one, Tim. Do you know what? The one thing I miss the most, it was an interesting concept. I had this discussion with some friends of mine, and, you know, as you do, you have friends in the industry. I miss the clock out from school
Mm.
because at 3 p.m., I knew that I wouldn't get called all kinds of names and I would have 12 to 14 hours of me time. I would not have social media that could mean I was on demand. I would not have the ability to receive text messages or people to call me. And the only way you could is you could call your home phone. And that was never answered by us. It was always answered by our parents. And I think it's a forgone era. And unfortunately, our on-demand generation we live in today has changed that. You know, our ability to focus and concentrate has diluted heavily. Statistics have shown that if you digitally detox at least an hour a day, your ability to concentrate increases dramatically. Turn off notifications, for example. One of the reasons we often get distracted during meetings is we leave Outlook, for example, open, or, you know, our Gmail is open, and then they notify us If as an example, I don't wear a digital watch. I don't wear anything as a digital reminder because it creates anxiety. And so what do I miss about that is the ability to turn off. And, I love nostalgia. I do. My biggest joy, and taking you down a journey here, Tim, was I used to play tennis with my best friends on the weekends for endless hours in summer. And then we'd go jump in my friend's pool. And I remember the first time the Sony Walkman came out with the yellow coated waterproof Sony Walkman.
Oh yeah.
I was a king. I could wear that during tennis and then go and jump into the pool and it would still function. Mind you, the headphones eventually gave in because, they weren't waterproof. But to your point, that ability was brilliant. And I get it now. Technology it has slowly caught up. We can dip our phones into anything below 5 meters. We'll eventually break it, but simpler. Life was much simpler when technology wasn't every single step of what we do. Can I change that? Go back? No. What I can do is I can use examples for digital detox. I don't know about you, but I love going out to dead spot locations, say in the Blue Mountains, staying in a hotel or a resort where I can't be contacted and just take one day to just be away from it all, which is ironic considering what I do.
Yeah, I was going to ask you how you manage distractions, and I guess you've answered it. You're like physically removing yourself from
It's
the
hard.
information world.
Mate, it's hard. It is so hard. Being a technology professional, we're always on call, on demand. But there has to be, you've got to put in boundaries. Like, I hate to admit this, but when we get consumed by constantly being interrupted, our mind doesn't get the ability to concentrate, and this is shown by dopamine levels that we post online for that response, right? We want those clicks, we want those comments, we want those likes so that we feel those dopamine hits. And the unfortunate scenario for that is you get addicted to it, right? And as in any addiction, it's really hard to drop. That's one of the things that, even I had to take a big step back and go, these are not hits that are going to be beneficial to me long term. So disable notifications. I've done that on a number of my applications. When I'm in a meeting, for example, I use the Microsoft tools that are available to me to disable that. Same way as when I get home. I use the tools available on my smartphone to go do not disturb so that I have periods where I don't have constant bombarding of notifications, to give me that brain downtime. I love being able to read a book, as an example. I don't know about you, Tim, but I remember the days on a Sunday. You get a newspaper. Do you remember these things?
Oh yeah, so that is the wrapper that fish and chips came in, is that correct?
It's true. It's true. It's where it ended up pretty much most of the time. Your local fish and chip shop used to appreciate you dropping off the newspapers.
Yeah, the newspaper. And the bigger the paper, like the broader the sheet, the more important it felt.
Yeah. And you could hide behind it if
Mm.
you're in a coffee shop. It was great. But one of my biggest joys is when I get on a plane to go somewhere is going and getting a magazine. I love my cars, so I will quite happily grab the latest version. And don't get me wrong, that information that I'm generally reading is probably being repeated 50 times online with the media I've already read.
Sure.
But it's the touch, the feel, it's that I'm away from a digital asset, which is why I post the nostalgia, because it's a good idea for people to digitally detox as much as they can.
Yeah, that's interesting, that angle, because it wasn't as much of a problem in the past, even though, technology was becoming part of our lives with the PC and the waterproof Walkman. But what interests me is I actually have a sense, like a warm feeling or like a feeling of affection to some of the things you present in your LinkedIn posts. I'm not sure what that is. Like nostalgia, I guess it's almost like a powerful drug, isn't it?
Yeah, It's also the feeling of comfort, right? We've come from such a different way of thinking. And I had this a topic that I spoke at the other day. I don't know about you, but I had a Nokia 8110. I think
Hmm.
most people, let's be fair, at that time, it was an amazing tool. It was not expensive. An 8110 was a couple of $100 when they first came out, if that. Had interchangeable screen covers. But you know the one thing that the Nokia did that no device does today?
What's that?
Didn't create data.
Oh, right.
It was never leaving that device. That device in itself, the most you ever got was a text message list. You couldn't use other than the games like Snake, which it didn't keep your score. It didn't care who you were. And every time you went back, it was the exact same start. None of that data ever left the device. So if you were to think about it, in 1 minute of a day, we create 170 trillion bytes of data, trillions, not megabytes, not gigabytes, things that we commonly refer to. And most people will be aware of an iPhone, for example. The base iPhone, the average iPhone is 256 gigs. It would take millions of iPhones to recreate physically what online is created every single minute of the day. And that has to be stored somewhere and it has to be kept somewhere. It has to be maintained, backed up. The unfortunate scenario is we don't realize how much we create. And as consumers, we do it ourselves. I mean, every time you take a photo, that in itself could be 4 to 5 megs of data, you know. And if you're taking an SLR photo, for example, a good DSLR, you're taking gigabytes of data. This still has to be stored, managed. So back to your point. Yes, absolutely. Nostalgia is great, but I need to give perspective for back then because what we saw back in a common era versus the size and scale that we see today is very different. And we need to be mindful of how we evolve with that.
Yeah. So for you to make time and look back as you're also looking forward because of your work consulting with businesses, it suggests to me that you make time for reflection. You talked about being distracted by the dopamine hit, but I can see the logo behind you for ASE, ask, solve, evolve. Those three words suggest to me that you actually spend time reflecting and questioning things and trying to understand a subject rather than just jump from one shiny object to the next.
That and gratitude, Tim, one of the biggest things that can really make our lives and value so highly important. The question is ask. Your point is, yes, I like using reflection. You know, every single night I have this moment where I sit down before I retire for the night and outline my top three gratitudes. You know, what have I done today that made a difference and what am I grateful for? And so, yeah, nostalgia and reflection, they're key to us to not get caught up in the rat race every single day because more often than not, Tim, we get caught up in this, you know, must do this, must respond to this, but we don't highlight our values and what's important and what are we doing today to actually make sure we feel fulfilled by what we did today. So I love the concept, and I'm really grateful for you to see that reflection is key to me. And I like to make sure that because when I do make a change in an organization's, you know, business, it's important for me to then be grateful for that they chose us or chose me to be part of that journey because at the end of the day, we're changing people's livelihoods. So yeah, absolutely. Reflection is key to everything I do.
Excellent. So, how do you keep current on like what's important for you and your clients? I ask because a lot of what we see online, what is presented as thought leadership, isn't really thought leadership. It's just repackaging data points or obvious things from other sources. So, like, how do you evaluate information for yourself and for your clients? And how do you keep up to date with that?
You know, that's one of the most poignant conversations that our marketing team consistently hits me with, Tim. So thank you, considering that you are in that industry. Um, ask is the ultimate part. Like you've got to ask the question. The thing I found about asking questions is the first question is never actually the truth. Most people, when you sit down and ask about what's going on, how can I help, respond to you with what's immediately in the forefront of their head. Now, prime example is there's a burning issue. This is an offline. I've had this problem with my CEO's device, for example. If you sat down, the other thing about time is that we're, again, time poor. So we generally react with a knee-jerk reaction to that. So I've asked the question, and the first instinct is to go, I can help you with that, rather than going, okay, that's great. That's certainly something we can assist with. But I want to ask more, understand more about what you do as an organization and what's important to you. What's that business going to look like in 12 months? And how does that reflect on what you're going to do between now and then? And how do we assist in that journey? Because answering an immediate question is great, don't get me wrong, but being a part of a journey is so much more important. And I look this as a relationship, don't try and get your date into bed on the first date. I always say this to most of the people that I meet with, because at the end of the day, you want a journey, you want a partnership, you want that marriage, you want to be together. And look, don't get me wrong, same prospecting in relationships goes within business. Not everything lasts forever, but make sure whilst you're together that you give everything in that relationship. And that's the same we give when we talk about technologies. What's the roadmap? Ask the hard questions, but then make sure that you're on that journey with them, not just because it's for you, but it's for both of you. And so what do I find important for clients? That varies depending on size and scale, budgets, what's a high priority in the board. Ironically, cybersecurity has taken a lot of profile over the last 6 months. It probably could have done with a bit more, let's call it market time about 2 years ago before things really ramped up, and that was during the pandemic. And the technology landscape changed dramatically between 2020 and 2022 because we all started working remotely, and digitally means a lot of technologies were, let's call it, taken up quickly and not properly. So asking those questions is pertinent. We then sit down and do quite often roundtables, Tim. So you're welcome to join one of those. And in fact, you were with me on one of those last year, where we sit and we take the gauge of the room and the audience by a slower, more open forum. Take the time, and as much as I hate to admit it, listening. We've got two ears, one mouth. You choose that in proportion.
An in-person event, I mean, sure, there's webinars, there's online conversations such as what we're having now, but actually physically being in a room, a venue with fellow professionals, not on your phone, not distracted by email. Do you see like a lot of value in that, in these sort of analog gatherings to, solve technical problems?
Ironically, yeah. And some of the best conversations we've ever had with board members or directors is literally like that concept of you leave your digital asset at the door. You're not allowed to bring anything in. No phones, no watches, no laptops. Let's have conversations, pen and paper and whiteboards, and then go through this and actually understand, what is it that we need to do here? And then not be distracted by that, because when you scratch the surface, the likelihood is, as I said to you, the first question that you ask may not be the answer that you're needing to address in a longer term sense. And that in-person event is irreplaceable, excuse me. And one of the key factors that, we lost during the pandemic was one-on-one, in person. The ability for us to just get on a virtual Zoom, get on a Teams, Cisco WebEx, you name it, there's a ton of technologies out there, even FaceTime. That sort of stuff has been lost and forgotten, the one-on-one. And human interaction makes a big difference when you're in person to how you actually get to an underlying need realistically. And that's the reason why, as humans, we are probably one of the only animals that respond well to touch. And you see that through a number of, our genetic makeups and things. So being able to be in front of someone and being able to actually physically be in front of someone and touch them makes the huge difference.
Hey, that's a good idea for one of your retro tech posts. You just have a photograph of a whiteboard and a table and some chairs. And you say, who remembers this?
Hey, you know what? Yeah, and then you put like stick figures on the board and go, no, not the virtual version. I'm talking about the physical version.
Yeah, you'll just blow people's minds. Like, what is this?
Wait, you were doing things on a whiteboard? Why isn't that digital Kindle or whatever version? Like, yeah, I still love that. By the way, I'm a massive fan of letting um, younger generations go nuts on a whiteboard with colored textures. I love what they come up with. It is such an amazing thing to see.
Yeah, that's cool.
Not
Um,
using like your digital versions.
Kristof, I have enjoyed this conversation. I actually feel that you've fixed my feed, fixed my digital life with all these tips. If people want to discover more about you, reach out to you, find out what you're about, what ASE is about, plug all your channels.
Thanks, mate. If you want to reach with me on LinkedIn, feel free. It's Kristof, Kristof, Kazmer, Kazmer, and you just type that in after linkedin.com. You'll find my profile for ASE. It's a very simple one, Tick. You'll love this one, www.ase.tech, ase.tech. Can't get any easier than that. So feel free to reach out. All my channels are always available. Tim, it's always great to catch up with you, mate. I love seeing your content. Love listening to Fix My Feed. It always gives me some valuable insights and thoughts, and I'm hoping that I can challenge people on that as well with this one.
You have, and it's no exaggeration to say this has been the most information dense episode yet. So, Kristof, I thank you for that.
Mate, and I thank you for having me on it, Tim. I look forward to being in person for that coffee soon.